Thank you, Brad. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Simon Hunt from Parents Against Child Abuse. Would you like to come over, Simon?
Thank you. Right. Well, thank you very much, Barry, for organising all of this. It's marvellous for people that are going through the problems of family law and child custody issues to be able to get it off their chest, because it's the big silent scream often. I've personally been involved in this for 7.5 years, going on 8 years. The reason I wanted to make this address today is because I reckon I've got the solution. I've been looking at this problem long and hard, and I think the solution is pretty easy. So I want to share with you what I believe the solution is. And if anybody's got any comments about that or thinks I'm barking up the wrong tree, I'm very interested to hear from them. I'll just briefly go over the system that, as I see it. I'll make that really brief because everybody knows how terrible it is, and what I see the solution and how it'll operate. And I also want to touch briefly on the debate and what I see as the distractions as opposed to the issues and who represents what in the debate. So I'll just gloss over quickly the situation now. As you all know, when a marriage breaks down or a de facto relationship breaks down and there's kids involved, the first thing that happens is typically one parent moves out with the children or kicks the other parent out of the home using intervention orders, AVOs normally. And that starts off a whole process whereby the excluded parent has to make an application to court and mount a legal case and then convince a judge that he is a fit parent to see his own children. And things get more and more difficult as time goes on. The abuse allegations increase. There's family welfare reports that get prepared. They're biased. One party makes allegations that get reported in family welfare reports. Then the barristers argue about it. Then there's psychological tests. Again there's bias, more arguments, hugely expensive. The children just go out of their minds with distress, which causes the parents to go out of their minds with distress, and the whole thing turns into an absolute disaster. The family court, unfortunately, law courts have the role of determining who the victim is and who the culprit is, and that's how they operate effectively in criminal law and commercial law. You know, they see the evidence, it's an adversarial process, and they determine who the victim is and who the culprit is and work out how much to compensate the victim and how much to punish the culprit. And of course they apply exactly the same system in family law. They listen to the arguments and the evidence and they go, right. And the tool they use is custody of the child. So if you've been a bad boy and the barrister's done a real job on you, you don't get to see your kids. Well, of course that hurts you, but what about your kids? And of course there's nothing more painful than watching your kids suffer and being able to do nothing about it. The whole process is a complete disaster. We've all seen barristers destroy people in court. It's not a pretty sight. Plus the language is terrible. They talk about custodial parents or primary caregivers and then the contact parent. Now they're supposed to be bringing in all these reforms to family law, and they're supposed to be encouraging shared parenting, yet they all talk about contact parent and primary caregiver. Hardly, and resident parent. And a lot of the speakers we had today, especially the ministers, they were using the same language. You know? And of course politicians, being so polarised, look at things in terms of two sides no matter what they're looking at. And of course family law doesn't involve two sides. It involves delivering the best result for children. If they focus on the children, they deliver satisfaction to both parents, and that's what we want. So it is an absolute disaster. The children loses the love and the guidance and meaningful relationship with one of their parents, usually the father. The long-term damage this causes is well known and documented and accepted by all. Nobody disagrees with the damage caused by throwing a parent out of the child's life. And unfortunately, it's so much worse than losing a parent through death, because the child grows up thinking that half of it is bad. They have terrible self-esteem problems. And of course, all of this is reflected in the statistics. And I hesitate there because it's so overwhelming. I'm getting to the solution, thank you. The solution is a silver bullet. Now, I won't read through all of them, but I can tell you they're all over. It would start off at 60%, 70%, 75%, 80%, 90%. And of course that's drug addiction, suicide, mental problems, problems with the criminal law. It is an absolute disgrace. 70% of all, here we go, 85% of children with behavioural problems, guess what? They come from single-parent families. So what are we doing to protect our children from this? Nothing at the moment. And of course that's what we're all here to do, to try to bring about change. Now, and I might add that one of the worst problems of single-parent children is sexual abuse. And isn't it ironic that accusations of sexual abuse are used to exclude parents tactically in custody cases? Single-parent children are more exposed to unstable families and relationships and therefore sexual abuse. It's difficult. You can't expect a single parent to look after their child 24/7, so strangers invariably end up as carers of children. Of course it's dangerous for children. Children's well-being in life is the most important thing to most people. For parents it's a biological imperative. Children are our future. We need to protect them from conflict, the conflict and distress of having one of their parents unilaterally removed by the other upon separation or marital breakdown. This is where it all starts, when that parent is pushed out of the lives of those children. Now, I believe the way to do this, and I've been thinking about this long and hard, is to allow that excluded parent to apply for immediate relief from the court by way of an order for restoration of their involvement with their children, a restoration of contact order, if you like. Such an order would work in exactly the same way as an intervention order or an AVO. It would be, it would allow up to 7 days of contact out of 14. So if somebody wanted less than 7 days, they could say, I want 6 days, I want 5 days out of 14. It's signed off and it's immediately enforceable by the police. So mum doesn't want to take the kids around to dad, well, the police are on our doorstep saying, well, here's an order, you have to hand over the kids to their father because here's the order. And of course, like an AVO, it goes straight to court, no delays, and if the woman or the man, but typically it's the mother, has good reason to fear for the children's safety when they're with the other parent, well, that's when she can present her evidence to the court. If she has grounds for excluding the other parent, she can present that evidence to the court and that parent will be excluded based on her evidence. And then, of course, it can go off to the family court and be properly investigated. This would cut out 90% of all of the cases that go to family court, because how many women are going to go to court, or men, but because it's mostly mothers, how many mothers are going to go to court and build a case to exclude their children's fathers? They're not. The only reason it happens so much now is because they can just do it by clicking their fingers and getting an intervention order. Accusations of partner violence. This is another way that fathers are excluded from children's lives. Accusations of partner violence should not be allowed to deny children time with their other parent. when arrangements can be made to avoid all interaction between the parents. So obviously that's having changeovers at school, preferably, or by other third parties. When it's school holidays, you can always get a third party, friend or a relation, or you can even use those horrible contact services if you like. This way the family courts or the Federal Magistrates Court can focus on the cases where the child really is at risk, where allegations aren't made just to protect the status quo, which has been wrongfully established in the first place, as is most often the case now. This would lead to reduced risk of bad decisions, and we hear of mothers complaining about, we hear of anti-shared parenting activists complaining about children being sent to abusive fathers. Well, I find it very hard to believe that any father would abuse their children, but that's just my personal view, and I have to accept that occasionally it does happen. Well, even in those cases, the judge is less likely to make a bad decision because he's not going to be overwhelmed with all those applications that are contrived. The benefits of this solution, they're numerous and they're compelling. Firstly, it prevents conflict. No excluded parent, no aggrieved party, no distress, no anger, no pain, no emotional trauma to the children. What distresses a parent more than seeing their children suffer? Nothing causes conflict and distress as much as denying a parent involvement with their children. You know, you wouldn't go into a paddock and try and stop a cow from being with its calf because you'd get right bollocking. It's the same thing with humans, and it causes immense distress. The effect, it would prevent most custody disputes from even starting in the first place, and this is my main point, because there is no aggrieved party to initiate proceedings. Importantly, it puts into effect Australia's stated obligations as signatories of the UN Charter of Children's Rights to a relationship with both their parents. The stability and the status quo of shared parenting, that is the child's experience in an intact marriage, is preserved. By protecting children's rights to association with both their parents, we are acting in their best interests. So lots of benefits there. Solves most of the problems. It is my submission that this is a silver bullet. This removes the problem. We've all been focusing on solving the symptoms of the problem, the CSA, the false allegations. We can remove the problem altogether by protecting the children from having their parents removed in the initial instance, in the first place. I want to comment briefly on issues that have polarised the debate about family law reform, and it needs to be remembered here that there are lots of representatives in this discussion who have vested interests in maintaining the portrayal of frightened mums and angry dads, those who are ideologically disposed to helping women and by hindering men. Social workers, for example, go to university and they learn about patriarchal men and how all men are bastards, and then they go out and practice what they've learned. Shouldn't surprise anybody. These groups usually claim to represent women, and I'd like to ask all the women here: how many women do you think that these groups, like the Women's Refuge Centre and the various other women's activists, represent normal Australian women? Women that love children and women that love men. Thank you. What's more important to women than men? What's more important to men than women? This gender polarised debate is an absolute a furphy. It's a power grab and nothing more. It's despicable. 90% of people support shared parenting solution. How could it possibly be that they're all men? It's an absolute nonsense. And the terrible thing about these vested interests, most of them are vested because they derive their income from the industry, and of course they're not going to want to end that. And of course the rest of them are vested interests because they're on this nutty anti-male trip. They think that somehow by marginalising men they're improving conditions for women. Nonsense. Abuse of women and children is the main argument used to oppose shared parenting, despite the fact that excluding fathers generally causes increased distress and disadvantage for children and mothers. They've got to shoulder the whole 100% of the burden of looking after the kid, for example. We're constantly being told Australia says no to violence against women, as if violence towards men doesn't matter, despite the statistical evidence that females perpetrate slightly more partner violence than men. And anybody, all you have to do is go to the internet. It's well known that partner violence is equally perpetrated by men and women. It's not a wrestling match. The fact that the man's bigger and stronger has got nothing to do with it. It's not a contest of strength. It's somebody losing the plot and going the bash on the other. And of course, the women like to the social workers and the family court and the practitioners like to talk about the other forms of abuse: psychological abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, and perceived abuse. Well, of course, as we all know, emotional abuse, and as we all know, men cop emotional abuse just as much, if not a lot more, than women in some areas. For example, the kitchen. You know, if you're a man, you don't want to put your foot wrong in the kitchen, otherwise you get your head bitten off. And that's just the way things are. But, you know, to use these arguments to exclude a parent from a children's life is abuse of the child. Unfortunately, the extreme exclusionist views of interest groups who oppose shared parenting, the shared parenting solution, are often relied on for expert advice in inquiries like this, forums like this, and in the courts. We've got to resist this because they're acting against the interests of our children. It's my submission that their views are at odds with the community and at odds with children, and they're given undue weight. I commend the government. Unfortunately, there's no representatives of the government here anymore, but I commend the government for its effort to change what is essentially a mutually exclusive court process. In other words, one of the parents cops it. Into one that protects children from losing a parent. They have done things to move in that direction. As you know, it hasn't been terribly successful, and they need to do a lot more. But at least they're starting to try. Once it acts to protect children from substantially losing a parent in the first place, it will have succeeded in preventing most custody cases from even going to court. The family relationship centres will then be more effective because one party won't be able to remove the other off their own bat, as happens now. It's a mistake to look at family law as a gender issue. It's a children's issue. Men and women's interests mostly are aligned on the issue of shared parenting. This is what the polls illustrate. If there is a dichotomy in this debate, it's between people on one hand and vested interests on the other. Accommodating the demands of groups opposed to shared parenting is electorally unpopular and does not secure the female vote. I wish we had a few ministers in here so I could remind them of that. If they want to be popular in the electorate, what they have to do is protect children from having one of their parents removed. I believe that if the Liberal Party came out and made a public declaration of supporting children, protecting children from having one of their parents removed upon separation, in the way I suggested, I believe it would be enough to get Liberal Party back into power. And I've actually issued a press release about this. Hopefully it'll be run, because the Liberal Party, God bless them, they need something to get them over the line. And as bad as they are, they're better than the Labor Party. I mean, you know, I don't like the Iraq War, I don't like kids overboard, I don't like all the lies, but, you know, the most important thing in the world for everybody is children. I believe my submission represents a solution.
Excuse me, I'd like to say that I hope this isn't the representation of the lone fathers. Tonight you have just currently slandered so
Excuse me, I haven't finished. You can ask me questions afterwards.
Groups, and I would respectfully request that this is not the attitude of the lone fathers or all these organisations here who've managed to make their point without slandering females, political groups or anything else, and I'm sorry that I don't appreciate the tone of it. Yes. What he has to say can be said without having to denigrate other people in this room. I'm sorry.
Well, look, thank you for that. Thank you for that interjection. I should point out.
Excuse me, let the speaker finish because we're out of time.
I've only got a little bit there. Thank you for your interjection. I'm just as emotional about this as anybody. I haven't been able to see my daughter for 2 years because a judge said that my wife would be too distressed if I was allowed to see my daughter and that I was uncooperative. Nobody will find out about that because you won't see it in the news, it won't be on television. But this sort of stuff happens every day, and there's other horror cases that I've heard of that have just made me gasp. So don't talk to me about abusing, criticising women. I have just explained in my speech how women and men love each other and need each other. So I reject your criticisms. Now, I believe that my submission represents a solution that has not been explored. I haven't heard anybody else say that this is how you solve the problem. I reckon it is. Please come forward, tell me if you think that for some reason this won't work, because I believe once you stop the status quo of an excluded parent from even starting in the first place, there's nothing to argue about, there's no aggrieved party. We've all been looking at what the courts can or should do to restore contact after it's been denied. It's a clawback situation. I've got 3 sentences. I'll finish. Rather than how to prevent it from being denied in the first place, I'd ask every one of you to think about this approach, which is about removing the problem, not fixing the symptoms. In closing, my question to everybody, and especially the government, is will the government condone one party unilaterally removing the other parent from a child's life? Will it condone this practice? Or will it ensure that only a court can make such a life-changing decision based on evidence presented to it? Will it deliver what all of us want so desperately, happy, successful children with 2 parents in their lives? Thank you. Are there any questions?